The Story of My Life. Part 5. The desire that first prompted me to take part in the play was the wish to win enough for my score, $2. This I succeeded in doing, and thereupon I was inspired with the hope of being able to settle all the debts I had made at that time by my winnings at play. Just as I had hoped to learn composition most quickly by Langier's method, but had found myself hampered in my object for a long period by unexpected difficulties, so my plan for speedily improving my financial position was likewise doomed to disappointment. To win was not such an easy matter, and for some 3 months I was such a victim to the rage for gambling that no other passion was able to exercise the slightest influence over my mind. Neither the Fechtboden, where the students' fights were practiced, nor the beer house, nor the actual scene of the fights, ever saw my face again. In my lamentable position I racked my brains all day to devise ways and means of getting the money wherewith to gamble at night. In vain did my poor mother try everything in her power to induce me not to come home so late at night, although she had no idea of the real nature of my debauches. After I had left the house in the afternoon I never returned till dawn the next day, and I reached my room, which was at some distance from the others, by climbing over the gate, for my mother had refused to give me a latchkey. In despair over my ill luck, my passion for gambling grew into a veritable mania, and I no longer felt any inclination for those things which at one time had lured me to student life. I became absolutely indifferent to the opinion of my former companions and avoided them entirely. I now lost myself in the smaller gambling dens of Leipzig, where only the very scum of the students congregated. Insensible to any feeling of self-respect, I bore even the contempt of my sister Rosalie. Both she and my mother hardly ever deigning to cast a glance at the young libertine whom they only saw at rare intervals, looking deadly pale and worn out. My ever-growing despair made me at last resort to foolhardiness as the only means of forcing hostile fate to my side. It suddenly struck me that only by dint of big stakes could I make big profits. To this end I decided to make use of my mother's pension, of which I was trustee of a fairly large sum. That night I lost everything I had with me except $1. The excitement with which I staked that last coin on a card was an experience hitherto quite strange to my young life. As I had had nothing to eat, I was obliged repeatedly to leave the gambling table owing to sickness. With this last $1 I staked my life, for my return to my home was, of course, out of the question. Already I saw myself in the grey dawn, a prodigal son, fleeing from all I held dear, through forest and field towards the unknown. My mood of despair had gained so strong a hold upon me that, when my card won, I immediately placed all the money on a fresh stake, and repeated this experiment until I had won quite a considerable amount. From that moment my luck grew continuously. I gained such confidence that I risked the most hazardous stakes, for suddenly it dawned upon me that this was destined to be my last day with the cards. My good fortune now became so obvious that the bank thought it wise to close. Not only had I won back all the money I had lost, but I had won enough to pay off all my debts as well. My sensations during the whole of this process were of the most sacred nature. I felt as if God and his angels were standing by my side and were whispering words of warning and of consolation into my ears. Once more I climbed over the gate of my home in the early hours of the morning, this time to sleep peacefully and soundly and to awake very late, strengthened and as though born again. No sense of shame deterred me from telling my mother, to whom I presented her money, the whole truth about this decisive night. I voluntarily confessed my sin in having utilized her pension, sparing no detail. She folded her hands and thanked God for his mercy, and forthwith regarded me as saved, believing it impossible for me ever to commit such a crime again. And, truth to tell, gambling had lost all fascination for me from that moment. The world, in which I had moved like one demented, suddenly seemed stripped of all interest or attraction. My rage for gambling had already made me quite indifferent to the usual student's vanities, and when I was freed from this passion also, I suddenly found myself face to face with an entirely new world. To this world I belonged henceforth. It was the world of real and serious musical study, to which I now devoted myself heart and soul. Even during this wild period of my life, my musical development had not been entirely at a standstill. On the contrary, it daily became plainer that music was the only direction towards which my mental tendencies had a marked bent. Only I had got quite out of the habit of musical study. Even now it seems incredible that I managed to find time in those days to finish quite a substantial amount of composition. I have but the faintest recollection of an overture in C major, 6/8 time, and of a sonata in B-flat major arranged as a duet. The latter pleased my sister Ottilia, who played it with me, so much that I arranged it for orchestra. But another work of this period, an overture in B-flat major, left an indelible impression on my mind on account of an incident connected with it. This composition, in fact, was the outcome of my study of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in about the same degree as Lubald und Adelaide was the result of my study of Shakespeare. I had made a special point of bringing out the mystic meaning in the orchestra, which I divided into three distinctly different and opposite elements. I wanted to make the characteristic nature of these elements clear to the score reader the moment he looked at it by a striking display of color, and only the fact that I could not get any green ink made this picturesque idea impossible. I employed black ink for the brass instruments alone. The strings were to have red and the wind green ink. This extraordinary score I gave for perusal to Heinrich Dorn, who was at that time musical director of the Leipzig Theatre. He was very young, and impressed me as being a very clever musician and a witty man of the world, whom the Leipzig public made much of. Nevertheless, I have never been able to understand how he could have granted my request to produce this overture. Some time afterwards I was rather inclined to believe with others, who knew how much he enjoyed a good joke, that he intended to treat himself to a little fun. At the time, however, he vowed that he thought the work interesting, and maintained that if it were only brought out as a hitherto unknown work by Beethoven, the public would receive it with respect, though without understanding. It was the Christmas of the fateful year 1830. As usual, there would be no performance at the theatre on Christmas Eve, but instead a concert for the poor had been organized, which received but scant support. The first item on the program was called by the exciting title, New Overture, Nothing More. I had surreptitiously listened to the rehearsal with some misgiving. I was very much impressed by the coolness with which Dorn fenced with the apparent confusion which the members of the orchestra showed with regard to this mysterious composition. The principal theme of the Allegro was contained in 4 bars. After every 4th bar, however, a 5th bar had been inserted, which had nothing to do with the melody, and which was announced by a loud bang on the kettle drum on the 2nd beat. As this drum beat stood out alone, the drummer, who continually thought he was making a mistake, got confused, and did not give the right sharpness to the accent as prescribed by the score. Listening from my hidden corner, and frightened at my original intention, this accidentally different rendering did not displease me. To my genuine annoyance, however, Dorn called the drummer to the front and insisted on his playing the accents with the prescribed sharpness. When, after the rehearsal, I told the musical director of my misgivings about this important fact, I could not get him to promise a milder interpretation of the fatal drum beat. He stuck to it that the thing would sound very well as it was. In spite of this assurance, my restlessness grew, and I had not the courage to introduce myself to my friends in advance as the author of the new overture. My sister Ottilia, who had already been forced to survive the secret readings of Lubald und Adelaide, was the only person willing to come with me to hear my work. It was Christmas Eve, and there was to be the usual Christmas tree, presents, etc. at my brother-in-law's, Friedrich Brockhaus, and both of us naturally wanted to be there. My sister, in particular, who lived there, had a good deal to do with the arrangements, and could only get away for a short while, and that with great difficulty. Our amiable relation accordingly had the carriage ready for her so that she might get back more quickly. I made use of this opportunity to inaugurate, as it were, my entree into the musical world in a festive manner. The carriage drew up in front of the theatre. Ottilia went into my brother-in-law's box, which forced me to try and find a seat in the pit. I had forgotten to buy a ticket, and was refused admission by the man at the door. Suddenly the tuning up of the orchestra grew louder and louder, and I thought I should have to miss the beginning of my work. In my anxiety I revealed myself to the man at the door as the composer of the new overture, and in this way succeeded in passing without a ticket. I pushed my way through to one of the first rows of the pit, and sat down in terrible anxiety. The overture began. After the theme of the black brass instruments had made itself heard with great emphasis, the red allegro theme started, in which, as I have already mentioned, every fifth bar was interrupted by the drum beat from the black world. What kind of effect the green theme of the wind instruments, which joined in afterwards, produced upon the listeners, and what they must have thought when black, red, and green themes became intermingled, has always remained a mystery to me, for the fatal drum beat, brutally hammered out, entirely deprived me of my senses, especially as this prolonged and continually recurring effect now began to rouse, not only the attention, but the merriment of the audience. I heard my neighbors calculating the return of this effect. Knowing the absolute correctness of their calculation, I suffered 10,000 torments, and became almost unconscious. At last I awoke from my nightmare when the overture, to which I had disdained to give what I considered a trite ending, came to a standstill most unexpectedly. No phantoms like those in Hoffmann's tales could have succeeded in producing the extraordinary state in which I came to my senses on noticing the astonishment of the audience at the end of the performance. I heard no exclamations of disapproval, no hissing, no remarks, not even laughter. All I saw was intense astonishment at such a strange occurrence, which impressed them, as it did me, like a horrible nightmare. The worst moment, however, came when I had to leave the pit and take my sister home. To get up and pass through the people in the pit was horrible indeed. Nothing, however, equaled the pain of coming face to face with the man at the door. The strange look he gave me haunted me ever afterwards, and for a considerable time I avoided the pit of the Leipzig theatre. My next step was to find my sister, who had gone through the whole sad experience with infinite pity. In silence we drove home to be present at a brilliant family festivity, which contrasted with grim irony with the gloom of my bewilderment. In spite of it all I tried to believe in myself, and thought I could find comfort in my overture to the Brot von Messina, which I believed to be a better work than the fatal one I had just heard. A reinstatement, however, was out of the question, for the directors of the Leipzig theatre regarded me for a long time as a very doubtful person, in spite of Dorn's friendship. It is true that I still tried my hand at sketching out compositions to Goethe's Faust, some of which have been preserved to this day, but soon my wild student's life resumed its sway and drowned the last remnant of serious musical study in me. I now began to imagine that because I had become a student I ought to attend the university lectures. From Traugott Krug, who was well known to me on account of his having suppressed the students' revolt, I tried to learn the first principles of philosophy. A single lesson sufficed to make me give this up. 2 or 3 times, however, I attended the lectures on aesthetics given by one of the younger professors, a man called Weiss. This perseverance was due to the interest which Weiss immediately aroused in me. When I made his acquaintance at my uncle Adolph's house, Weiss had just translated the Metaphysics of Aristotle, and, if I am not mistaken, dedicated them in a controversial spirit to Hegel. On this occasion I had listened to the conversation of these two men on philosophy and philosophers, which made a tremendous impression on me. I remember that Weiss was an absent-minded man, with a hasty and abrupt manner of speaking. He had an interesting and pensive expression which impressed me immensely. I recollect how, on being accused of a want of clearness in his writing and style, he justified himself by saying that the deep problems of the human mind could not in any case be solved by the mob. This maxim, which struck me as being very plausible, I at once accepted as the principle for all my future writing. I remember that my eldest brother Albert, to whom I once had to write for my mother, grew so disgusted with my letter and style that he said he thought I must be going mad. In spite of my hopes that Weiss's lectures would do me much good, I was not capable of continuing to attend them, as my desires in those days drove me to anything but the study of aesthetics. Nevertheless, my mother's anxiety at this time on my behalf made me try to take up music again. As Müller, the teacher under whom I had studied till that time, had not been able to inspire me with a permanent love of study, it was necessary to discover whether another teacher might not be better able to induce me to do serious work. Theodor Weinlich, who was choirmaster and musical director at St. Thomas's Church, held at that time this important and ancient post which was afterwards occupied by Schicht, and before him by no less a person than Sebastian Bach. By education he belonged to the old Italian school of music, and had studied in Bologna under Pater Martini. He had made a name for himself in this art by his vocal compositions, in which his fine manner of treating the parts was much praised. He himself told me one day that a Leipzig publisher had offered him a very substantial fee if he would write for his firm another book of vocal exercises similar to the one which had proved so profitable to his first publisher. Weinlich told him that he had not got any exercises of the kind ready at the moment, but offered him instead a new mass, which the publisher refused with the words, "Let him who got the meat gnaw the bones." The modesty with which Weinlich told me this little story showed how excellent a man he was. As he was in a very bad and weak state of health when my mother introduced me to him, he at first refused to take me as a pupil. But, after having resisted all persuasions, he at last took pity on my musical education, which, as he soon discovered from a fugue which I had brought with me, was exceedingly faulty. He accordingly promised to teach me, on condition that I should give up all attempts at composing for 6 months, and follow his instructions implicitly. To the first part of my promise I remained faithful, thanks to the vast vortex of dissipation into which my life as a student had drawn me. When, however, I had to occupy myself for any length of time with nothing but 4-part harmony exercises in strictly rigorous style, it was not only the student in me, but also the composer of so many overtures and sonatas, that was thoroughly disgusted. Weinlich, too, had his grievances against me, and decided to give me up. During this period I came to the crisis of my life, which led to the catastrophe of that terrible evening at the gambling den. But an even greater blow than this fearful experience awaited me when Weinlich decided not to have anything more to do with me. Deeply humiliated and miserable, I besought the gentle old man, whom I loved dearly, to forgive me, and I promised him from that moment to work with unflagging energy. One morning at 7 o'clock Weinlich sent for me to begin the rough sketch for a fugue. He devoted the whole morning to me, following my work bar by bar with the greatest attention, and giving me his valuable advice. At 12 o'clock he dismissed me with the instruction to perfect and finish the sketch by filling in the remaining parts at home. When I brought him the fugue finished, he handed me his own treatment of the same theme for comparison. This common task of fugue writing established between me and my good-natured teacher the tenderest of ties, for, from that moment, we both enjoyed the lessons. I was astonished how quickly the time flew. In 8 weeks I had not only gone through a number of the most intricate fugues, but had also waded through all kinds of difficult evolutions in counterpoint, when one day, on bringing him an extremely elaborate double fugue, he took my breath away by telling me that after this there was nothing left for him to teach me. As I was not aware of any great effort on my part, I often wondered whether I had really become a well-equipped musician. Weinlich himself did not seem to attach much importance to what he had taught me. He said, "Probably you will never write fugues or canons, but what you have mastered is independence. You can now stand alone and rely upon having a fine technique at your fingers' ends if you should want it." The principal result of his influence over me was certainly the growing love of clearness and fluency to which he had trained me. I had already had to write the above-mentioned fugue for ordinary voices. My feeling for the melodious and vocal had in this way been awakened. In order to keep me strictly under his calming and friendly influence, he had at the same time given me a sonata to write which, as a proof of my friendship for him, I had to build up on strictly harmonic and thematic lines, for which he recommended me a very early and childlike sonata by Pleyel as a model. Those who had only recently heard my overture must, indeed, have wondered how I ever wrote this sonata, which has been published through the indiscretion of Messrs. Breitkopf and Hartel. To reward me for my abstemiousness, Weinlich induced them to publish this poor composition. From that moment he gave me a free hand. To begin with, I was allowed to compose a fantasia for the pianoforte, in F-sharp minor, which I wrote in a quite informal style by treating the melody in recitative form. This gave me intense satisfaction because it won me praise from Weinlich. Soon afterwards I wrote 3 overtures which all met with his entire approval. In the following winter, 1831–1832, I succeeded in getting the first of them, in D minor, performed at one of the Gewandhaus concerts. At that time a very simple and homely tone reigned supreme in this institution. The instrumental works were not conducted by what we call a conductor of the orchestra, but were simply played to the audience by the leader of the orchestra. As soon as the singing began, Polenz took his place at the conductor's desk. He belonged to the type of fat and pleasant musical directors, and was a great favorite with the Leipzig public. He used to come on the platform with a very important-looking blue baton in his hand. One of the strangest events which occurred at that time was the yearly production of the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven. After the first 3 movements had been played straight through like a Haydn symphony, as well as the orchestra could manage it, Polenz, instead of having to conduct a vocal quartet, a cantata, or an Italian aria, took his place at the desk to undertake this highly complicated instrumental work, with its particularly enigmatical and incoherent opening, one of the most difficult tasks that could possibly be found for a musical conductor. I shall never forget the impression produced upon me at the first rehearsal by the anxiously and carefully played 3/4 time, and the way in which the wild shrieks of the trumpet, with which this movement begins, resulted in the most extraordinary confusion of sound. He had evidently chosen this tempo in order, in some way, to manage the recitative of the double basses. But it was utterly hopeless. Poland's was in a bath of perspiration, the recitative did not come off, and I really began to think that Beethoven must have written nonsense. The double bass player, Temler, a faithful veteran of the orchestra, prevailed upon Poland's at last, in rather coarse and energetic language, to put down the baton, and in this way the recitative really proceeded properly. All the same, I felt at this time that I had come to the humble conclusion, in a way I can hardly explain, that this extraordinary work was still beyond my comprehension. For a long time I gave up brooding over this composition, and I turned my thoughts with simple longing towards a clearer and calmer musical form. My study of counterpoint had taught me to appreciate, above all, Mozart's light and flowing treatment of the most difficult technical problems, and the last movement of his great symphony in C major in particular served me as example for my own work. My D minor overture, which clearly showed the influence of Beethoven's Coriolanus overture, had been favorably received by the public. My mother began to have faith in me again, and I started at once on a second overture, in C major, which really ended with a fugato that did more credit to my new model than I had ever hoped to accomplish. This overture, also, was soon afterwards performed at a recital given by the favorite singer, M.L. Palazzesi, of the Dresden Italian Opera. Before this I had already introduced it at a concert given by a private musical society called Euterpe, when I had conducted it myself. I remember the strange impression I received from a remark that my mother made on that occasion. As a matter of fact, this work, which was written in a counterpoint style, without any real passion or emotion, had produced a strange effect upon her. She gave vent to her astonishment by warmly praising the Egmont Overture, which was played at the same concert, maintaining that this kind of music was after all more fascinating than any stupid fugue. At this time I also wrote, as my third opus, an overture to Raupich's drama, König Enzio, in which again Beethoven's influence made itself even more strongly felt. My sister Rosalie succeeded in getting it performed at the theater before the play. For the sake of prudence they did not announce it on the program the first time. Dorn conducted it, and as the performance went off all right, and the public showed no dissatisfaction, my overture was played with my full name on the program several times during the run of the above-mentioned drama. After this I tried my hand at a big symphony, in C major. In this work I showed what I had learnt by using the influence of my study of Beethoven and Mozart towards the achievement of a really pleasant and intelligible work, in which the fugue was again present at the end, while the themes of the various movements were so constructed that they could be played consecutively. Nevertheless, the passionate and bold element of the Sinfonia Eroica was distinctly discernible, especially in the first movement. The slow movement, on the contrary, contained reminiscences of my former musical mysticism. A kind of repeated interrogative exclamation of the minor third merging into the fifth connected in my mind this work, which I had finished with the utmost effort at clearness, with my very earliest period of boyish sentimentality. When, in the following year, I called on Friedrich Rochlitz, at that time the Nestor of the musical aesthetes in Leipzig, and president of the Gewandhaus, I prevailed upon him to promise me a performance of my work. As he had been given my score for perusal before seeing me, He was quite astonished to find that I was a very young man, for the character of my music had prepared him to see a much older and more experienced musician. Before this performance took place, many things happened which I must first mention, as they were of great importance to my life. My short and stormy career as a student had drowned in me not only all longing for further development, but also all interest in intellectual and spiritual pursuits. Although, as I have pointed out, I had never alienated myself entirely from music, my revived interest in politics aroused my first real disgust for my senseless student's life, which soon left no deeper traces on my mind than the remembrance of a terrible nightmare. The Polish War of Independence against Russian supremacy filled me with growing enthusiasm. The victories which the Poles obtained for a short period during May 1831 aroused my enthusiastic admiration. It seemed to me as though the world had, by some miracle, been created anew. As a contrast to this, the news of the Battle of Ostroleka made it appear as if the end of the world had come. To my astonishment, my boon companions scoffed at me when I commented upon some of these events. The terrible lack of all fellow feeling and comradeship amongst the students struck me very forcibly. Any kind of enthusiasm had to be smothered or turned into pedantic bravado, which showed itself in the form of affectation and indifference. To get drunk with deliberate cold-bloodedness, without even a glimpse of humor, was reckoned almost as brave a feat as dueling. Not until much later did I understand the far nobler spirit which animated the lower classes in Germany in comparison with the sadly degenerate state of the university students. In those days I felt terribly indignant at the insulting remarks which I brought upon myself when I deplored the Battle of Ostroleka. To my honor be it said, that these and similar impressions helped to make me give up my low associates. During my studies with Weinlich, the only little dissipation I allowed myself was my daily evening visit to Kinchi, the confectioner in the Klostergasse, where I passionately devoured the latest newspapers. Here I found many men who held the same political views as myself, and I specially loved to listen to the eager political discussions of some of the old men who frequented the place. The literary journals, too, began to interest me. I read a great deal, but was not very particular in my choice. Nevertheless, I now began to appreciate intelligence and wit, whereas before only the grotesque and the fantastic had had any attraction for me. My interest in the issue of the Polish War, however, remained paramount. I felt the siege and capture of Warsaw as a personal calamity. My excitement when the remains of the Polish army began to pass through Leipzig on their way to France was indescribable, and I shall never forget the impression produced upon me by the first batch of these unfortunate soldiers on the occasion of their being quartered at the Green Shield, a public house in the meat market. Much as this depressed me, I was soon roused to a high pitch of enthusiasm, for in the lounge of the Leipzig Gewandhaus, where that night Beethoven's C minor symphony was being played, a group of heroic figures, the principal leaders of the Polish Revolution, excited my admiration. I felt more particularly attracted by Count Vincenz Tyszkiewicz, a man of exceptionally powerful physique and noble appearance, who impressed me by his dignified and aristocratic manner and his quiet self-reliance, qualities with which I had not met before. When I saw a man of such kingly bearing in a tight-fitting coat and red velvet cap, I at once realized my foolishness in ever having worshipped the ludicrously dressed-up little heroes of our students' world. I was delighted to meet this gentleman again at the house of my brother-in-law, Friedrich Brockhaus, where I saw him frequently. My brother-in-law had the greatest pity and sympathy for the Polish rebels, and was the president of a committee whose task it was to look after their interests, and for a long time he made many personal sacrifices for their cause. The Brockhaus establishment now became tremendously attractive to me. Around Count Vincenz Tyszkiewicz, who remained the lodestar of this small Polish world, gathered a great many other wealthy exiles, amongst whom I chiefly remember a cavalry captain of the name of Bansamer, a man of unlimited kindness, but of a rather frivolous nature. He possessed a marvelous team of 4 horses which he drove at such breakneck speed as to cause great annoyance to the people of Leipzig. Another man of importance with whom I remember dining was General Bem, whose artillery had made such a gallant stand at Ostroleka.